The Football Show on Off the Ball.
With Sky. Watch every live Premier League game this season on Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
I'm prepared to do anything I can to play for my country again.
Do it then. What about your start to the game?
It wasn't bad, was it?
Why should an honest answer be a mistake?
How can a modern day manager not have a mobile phone?
Why should he?
Welcome along to the Football Show here on Off the Ball. Plenty for us to talk about over the next hour or so, including Irish teams involved in European competition, the champion Shamrock Rovers and Shelbourne looking to go a step closer. We already know that Shamrock Rovers will be playing in the group stages of European competition. All that needs to be determined now, will it be the Europa League or will it be the Conference League? While Shelbourne potentially 2 wins away from qualifying for the round of 16 group stage for the Women's Champions League. We're also taking a look back on the Premier League from the weekend just gone by, including Liverpool being frustrated last evening once again, and they're without a win ahead of playing Manchester United next week. Delighted to say that Dan McDonnell is with us. Dan, how are you getting on?
Hi, Will.
You're getting ready to head off to Hungary to watch Ferencváros against Shamrock Rovers, and like in a way I think all the players were very keen to stress last week, Dan, that it was just part of the job done by being assured of Conference League football, but they're not even looking at this final round playoff round for the Europa as bonus territory. They're genuinely looking to try and qualify for the second competition as opposed to the third in Europe.
Yeah, no, I think so, although I still think it would be interesting to sort of to plug into all sort of private discussions players are having. I think, I think they'll be fully motivated to go and get the job done. And like it is, I mean, I say get the job done, I mean, they are going to be outsiders, but it will be the focus. But I think it's probably a different type of pressure or a different type of thing. No matter what they say and no matter how they treat it, there is no doubt that if you speak to anyone at Rovers about the club's vision, the plan, etc., like it was the Conference League groups that was in their sort of radar, and they have that now. So it is. I do think there is an element of a bonus free hit about this. To be honest, I do feel that way. That doesn't mean they're not any less enthusiastic about the prospect of going through, but it's definitely different to last year at this time of the football calendar last year. Like they were preparing to play Flora Tallinn in a 2-legged tie to reach the Conference League, and that was pressure. That was, a game where the impact of losing had the potential to be substantial, and it was. Like it was a crushing disappointment for them. And there's probably going to be more enjoyment with this, a more glamorous. Okay, Ferencváros aren't, maybe aren't a name that sort of would be glamorous in the eyes of maybe some people listening, but it's going to Budapest to sort of play a proper team, good venue, good local interest. It's a good tie. It's one that they can really get stuck into, but there's something the other end, which is pretty sweet. And in a way, you could probably look at it and say that if you do end up in the Conference League, even, I suppose this is a good sort of level of the type of opponent, that they're going to need to face as the rest of this year progresses. So the more of these games they can get, the better as well too. So I think it's probably all positive, really.
Yeah, it's a step up in quality of opponent to what they faced in the European qualifiers so far. They were beaten Ferencváros by Karabag in the last round of the Champions League qualifiers to drop into this stage. We're probably familiar with Bogdan, who played in the Premier League and the Championship for a while with Liverpool and with Bolton. Was playing with Hungary at the Euros last year. They've got Besic, who was at Everton and Middlesbrough as part of their squad as well. And they've run off, this is now 4 Hungarian leagues in a row they've run off in recent years as well.
Yeah, like Hungarian football's had a bit of a revival the last couple of years. I mean, I suppose it's been well documented around maybe the major tournaments, and they were involved in that sort of, the group of death, in the Euros, and also I suppose Ireland played them in a friendly prior to that. So there'd be a sort of a broad awareness that that Hungarian football had a lull around a decade ago or so, and even I think club teams were struggling. And they've sort of, Ferencváros have stepped up and been involved in group stage competitions at a good level, and there is more expectation around them now, and certainly I do sometimes find these early stage Champions League ties, year on year it can be hard to follow the form, and there's a real danger of leaning on something that happened in, say, 2019 and thinking a team is the same standard. I mean, Karabag obviously played Dundalk in 2019. I would have covered both of those games. They were probably a good bit better than Dundalk at the time, but without necessarily being one of the most amazing teams that you've ever seen. And I think, Ferencváros, for example, they lost to Karabag. They were 3-0 down at home last week in a big game for them, which would make you think, but they're not a super intimidating side yet. In the previous round, they beat Slovan Bratislava well, who Shamrock Rovers would have gone out to last year. So there's all these little form lines you're trying to sort of make sense of and put some structure on it. And you do wonder, are they still one of these teams that's still in pre-season effectively, albeit they've had a couple of European ties now to get into the groove? And are they still like a better opponent to play now than, say, one of the Scandinavian teams, Nordic teams, who are mid-season and in full flow? And they could possibly be a tougher opponent now than someone like Ferencváros, even though Ferencváros may be in time be proven to be a better side.
What have you made of Shamrock Rovers' recent form then? We could almost trace it back to the very good performance at home against Ludogorets, came through comfy enough as it worked out against Scoopy. And then Stephen Bradley wasn't overly happy about the timing of the game against Derry so closely after that game last weekend. But what have you made of Rovers' form over the last couple of weeks?
No, they've been decent, I think. I mean, I think myself and others probably would have been quite critical and worried maybe to some degree after Ludogorets away game, where they had a really bad first half. And it sort of reminded you maybe a small bit of some of the first halves or some of the sloppier away games they had last year that really hurt them, where they conceded quite a lot of goals and set themselves sort of uphill tasks in away legs, that it was too hard for them to claw it back at home. But maybe with the passing of time, like their travel to Ludogorets was a nightmare. I think even it only came out probably a couple of days after when Stephen Bradley spoke about the extent of it, that it wasn't just that the fact that they had to fly out of, I think, Shannon for that game, and they couldn't get a charter route, so it was all different players and different routes going in different ways. Just not the way you should professionally prepare for a tie. And then they also, I think, got to a hotel which was pretty crappy, and they had to get out of it because it was so bad. So maybe on reflection, you have to give them a little bit of a pass for elements of that Ludogorets tie away, and say, maybe those factors didn't lend itself to a good first leg display. So if you take that out of it, I think the European performances, the 5 other games, have been pretty good, pretty competent. Still, I mean, you are still without Jack Byrne. He's back available now, but possibly still a bit to go. Pico Lopez, their main centre half, has been lost to injury. So I'm not sure if we've seen the 100% version of what they can be. And I still think probably, defensively, Shupi gave them some problems in the second half in Tallaght. So they have some questions to answer. And I think, Ferencváros will fancy playing them and think they can cause them problems. But I don't know. I think there's been a certain maturity in their displays, and they've started their home ties in all the European games very well, that I think they're equipped to do pretty well here. I'm not sure if they're capable of getting through this tie, but I certainly think they'll be very competitive in the tie. And then, that it should be alive coming down to sort of the second 45 in Tallaght next week, and they're in there with a chance of going through. So I think what you're seeing is, and this is always the problem sometimes for our clubs, and Stephen Kenny would have spoken about this recently, like he'd be he'd be a fan of this Shamrock Rovers side, but doesn't believe that they're tested regularly enough at home in such a way that they can maybe hit the level that they're capable of getting to. And maybe like these 5 or 6 weeks in a row now of European football, it's helping to bring them up to a level, and they're getting better as it goes along, because certainly in Shupi last week, what was a pretty momentous tie, or a pretty important tie, they pretty much cruised through it, and Shupi aren't terrible. They're not a terrific side, but I think, they will see in some, they're still alive potentially with a chance of getting to the Conference League. I don't think they were a bad team, but I think Rovers, were comfortably better over 2 legs, and would take a lot of encouragement from that.
They'll not have Manus as busy in too many games domestically this season as he was against Scoopy last time out, and they'll be trying their best for him not to have to pull off some of the heroics he did in Tala. The Jack Byrne injury situation, it's been frustrating for him personally, and I think also for the club, that he was about to come back, then he had a bit of a setback, and I think it was a groin injury that's put him out in recent weeks as well. Like, if Rovers are to do well in Europe, Jack Byrne's the type of player that you want to have there to give you that bit of control in midfield, and unfortunately for him, injuries have just come at a bad time for him this season.
Yeah, look, it's really unfortunate. I think if you were having the discussion at the start of the year about Rovers in Europe, what's going to happen this year, you would have probably gone to Jack Byrne, in the second or third sentence, kind of wondering, I suppose, that lingering thing was possibly there last year, that the Shamrock Rovers were very good in 2020, and 2019, the European performances were decent enough. 2020, they got knocked out by AC Milan, but they won the league well that year, and you kind of wondered, had they really missed Jack Byrne in Europe? Was that the missing link last year? So the fact that they've managed to probably hit some of their targets this year without him basically kicking the ball in Europe is impressive. As for the situation, he came on in Derry last week. He came on a bit earlier than expected because Graham Burke got a knock, and trying to speak to people who were there, I think he was okay, but I don't think we saw, a full Jack Byrne, which you wouldn't expect because he hasn't played much football recently. So I think there's, Rovers are going to be playing a lot of Thursday, Sunday in the next while. He is on his day. There's no doubt he's their best player. But can they afford to sort of throw him into a really high tempo European tie and risk losing him when you know that there's a really important stretch of games coming down the tracks here? Their title at home isn't wrapped up either. They played Dundalk in a big game on Sunday. So they need to figure out how best to get Jack Byrne into their side without sort of rushing it in such a way that's damaging. But God, you'd love to see him out there. I mean, you definitely feel that even at times in the Ludogorets away game where they struggled, there is something about Jack when he's playing well, the positions he takes up, the way they try to play the ball out. He just makes things happen a lot quicker for them and easier for them. But you need a full tilt Jack Byrne as well too, just for the workload that you sort of need from the player and the way they play. And Jack's position, there's a lot of sort of work involved in it, and if he's not 100% at it, then it's a risk to throw him into a game in Europe because it'll be exposed quicker than it might be at home.
Yeah, definitely. Liverpool, Dan, starting the season a little bit stuttering. Now they're going to be very bereft of options up front for the next 3 games, assuming that Darwin Núñez is going to get a 3-game ban for his headbutt last night in that 1-1 draw against Crystal Palace. Not ideal. You would have thought on paper, Fulham away, newly promoted team, Crystal Palace at home. Liverpool really should have been up there with Man City at the top of the table with 6 points, but even at this early stage they find themselves 4 points behind the defending champions.
Yeah, and in a way it still feels a bit absurd to be talking about ground being lost after 2 games, but you could see with the sort of the debate, the discussion around the game last night, that I think people are checking their natural urge to say it's early days, and realising that, no, this can be significant. This definitely, the standards being hit by the top teams are such that, this can be meaningful in time. Now look, they only need to beat City once, to for it to go to the last day in your head. You know what I mean? It's clearly not some kind of massive crisis, but it's just more so at the stage of what does the results say about what's coming down the tracks as well too. I mean, thankfully they have everyone wants to play Manchester United at the moment. Potentially, it's not the fixture you would think it would normally be in their heads, but it's more the case that I think Liverpool have gone to the well so many times in recent seasons, and it's like last season they played every single game that they possibly could, and it was an incredible season. And there's always that niggling fear that eventually they'll just hit this point where they just have a mini slump, because how do you keep going at that tempo? Now, in fairness, they did come from, the Fulham performance was very bad. I don't think you could call it anything else. They did come from a goal down with 10 men last night and had good spells in the game. So it's not, they are capable of sort of winning 7 or 8 in the bounce and all this being rendered to the past. But there is that little niggling fear naturally of like, how good could Man City be this year? Like, how significant are these points going to be? And what on paper looked like a decent start to the season, they've managed to complicate it. Like, I feel like there's part of me just thinks it's ridiculous to be talking about like ground being lost in a serious way, but you have to sort of reframe how you think when you see the levels that City are capable of going to now, and maybe think, yeah, this is important in some way.
Yeah, it feels different in this very dominant era for City, with Liverpool hanging with them in recent years, that it's the City team who, quite a few of their squad have already won 4 or 5 Premier League medals. They've been on teams that have gone plus 90 points in recent seasons. They've just been, winning accumulators along the way. Now, the one thing to throw maybe as a caveat in all of this is that it might not be a 90 plus season this year in terms of points, purely because there's going to be the break for the World Cup. There's going to be a lot of fatigue and attrition probably in the second half of the season with the amount of games they're playing first half of the year. But at the same time, City have got a pretty deep squad, which they're likely to add to over the next few weeks as well. They've even got Sergio Gomez in to finally get a first choice left back after Zinchenko leaving the club too. Like, I can't imagine, even if Bernardo Silva was to leave, that City's spending and depth of squad is over for this window anyway.
No, and it's true. Like, I mean, the World Cup is a massive variable this year. I think City do have more players than Liverpool, but as you say, they have a sort of a deeper, they have a deep enough squad. Like, Haaland's not going, and other important players aren't going to be involved. But it is sort of an element to throw into the mix. And of course, like, City are still going to be obsessed with trying to win this Champions League as well. So, post Christmas, if they end up in a difficult run there, and demanding sort of knockout ties, there's all these ways in which you can see slips happening. And you are right, maybe the nature of this season, it's even the other factor as well is because the World Cup is in the mix. The first half of the season is way more congested too, even in terms of those Champions League weeks, that you sort of 6 Champions League weeks, in a sort of a window that's around sort of 3 or 4 weeks shorter than usual, thereabouts. I know they're starting things maybe a small bit earlier, but still it's the same sort of, there is a log jam there that no matter how good teams are, you might see more sloppy ones like the Fulham day that Liverpool had. But I guess their problem is that they've probably used up a lot of their lives as regards that, so they need to be perfect around the congestion that's coming up. And you want to leave yourself even that breathing space that maybe you are going to have 1 or 2 difficult days. You don't want to have them now when there's no such excuses about congestion.
For Liverpool, I mean, the big change that they had this year was Sadio Mane going to Bayern Munich when he really wanted that move at the tail end of last season. He's hit the ground running in Munich so far. Darwin Núñez has come in. Last night, I think he fell for the frustration and ultimately hits out. It was stupidity, which he's probably going to learn from. But he's looked a little bit nervy in these first 2 games. I know he got in the end of the chance that Salah played across him for the Fulham game, but last night he was snatching out a few chances, looked a little bit nervy. A guy can have lots of quality. We saw how good he was for Benfica in the Champions League last year. It might take him a little bit of time to settle, and this ban is likely to probably slow that process up a little bit now too.
No, that's not going to help. I mean, yeah, I know. Like, the Fulham game, that was weird though, because his very presence sort of had a degree of helpful chaos that others were able to sort of run off it and capitalize on it. So, I know what you're saying about the nervousness that was there. I mean, I suppose one of the positives about sort of his arrival was, and it's a bit like the Haaland thing at City, it allows them to play in a slightly different way, and they have that option to sort of mix things up. And yeah, there's no doubt that like his sort of union with Salah and Diaz, and just sort of trying to figure out, how to react, how to run off him, etc. This is going to be slowed up by this sort of deserved ban that he's going to get. And also then in the meantime now, okay, they'll have, Firmino back in, I think next week they said, and it's going to be back to a Liverpool that people probably know what to expect from them, which doesn't always mean they can stop them, of course, but there was a sense that Núñez could almost give them something a little bit unpredictable, and that's gone for them now in the immediate term. So yeah, I don't know, like it's one where there's a sort of a spotlight on him now that may not have been there to that extent before, where he's got himself involved in this flashpoint incident. And now, you see Klopp talking about him, Milner last night, Virgil van Dijk, I think as well, quotes today. where all of a sudden, like, he's into this sort of Premier League news cycle that's 24/7 in your brain, and that he can't avoid it. So I suppose he'll have experienced a version of it before, but maybe nothing like this.
Yeah, they've got 10 injuries at the moment too. As you mentioned, Firmino at least comes back in. He can play as the false nine the next day. Jota's been out. I think he's got a bit of time before he's back in. They've just been picking up injuries at the start of the year. I think you could feel that frustration in Klopp, even when he was asked before the game about why Núñez was starting, and he was like, well, look, I literally have no other strikers, so he has to start tonight. And you could kind of feel his frustration to a certain extent. I was just thinking on City, when I mentioned their squad depth already, Dan, what's going to happen with Bernardo Silva? Because at the weekend he went around, clapped all four of the stands, gave away his jersey, put out a tweet on Sunday which heavily indicated he's about to leave. The reports are that Barcelona are now going to formulate a bid to try and get him. Generally, Pep Guardiola, when he's been asked about Bernardo Silva, said, look, if he's not happy at the club and he wants to go and a solution can be found, he'll leave. If not, he's going to stay. Really important player for City in the last couple of seasons, especially when he's dropped from a more advanced right wing position to more of a controlling role in the centre of their midfield. Be a huge loss to City and a huge loss to the Premier League if he's gone by the end of this month.
Yeah, like, it's really surprising because you don't really expect a player that has been that important to a top club to leave at the moment. Just where the Premier League is at financially, it's just. I know Mane left as well, and there is an element of the financial fair play, and there's things that clubs need to notionally do, as much as sort of there's an a la carte approach to the FFP stuff, really, in many respects. I mean, there's the odd gesture that needs to be done now and again, and City obviously moved out Sterling as well too, and clubs have to do a small bit of that type of housekeeping. But it's not one I would have been. I'm not covering the City beat, so I don't know. But it strikes me as the people who do cover that seem to have been a little bit surprised by it as well. It's not one where it's been sort of at the start of the summer people thought this might happen, because I think previously sort of there'd been a lot of praise. I think Pep had spoken about it. His sort of versatility, his intelligence, his ability to sort of understand different positions and different challenges within the game. And you would have thought with the congestion and all those factors we've mentioned previously, someone like that is a great asset. But clearly he's very tempted by the Barcelona idea still. That sort of allure remains, despite the sort of slightly chaotic nature of that club at the moment. But it does surprise me. Yeah, it's not one I would have pegged as a sort of an obvious departure. I think there would have been other players the City people might have thought might have been more vulnerable. But and I listen again. I mentioned Sterling. I mean Jesus is gone as well too. Zinchenko. So clearly there is a bit of balancing of the books going on there,
which is incredibly unusual for a club to do, because generally, even if you are Manchester City, who have been the dominant team in England over the last half decade, you don't generally, whatever about Bernardo Silva going to Barcelona, where maximum you're going to face him 2 games a season. In the case of, they've actively reinforced and helped both Chelsea and Arsenal by the way they've sold some very important players to them. I mean, we was talking to Mark Lawrenson about this last week, and Laura said it's as simple as City just don't see either of them as rivals. So they see this as a purely financial decision. Let Sterling go, take the 40 million quid, sell the other 2 guys for the best part of 70 million, and things rock on. It pays for the Haaland deal and we move on. But it's very unusual for a team to reinforce their at least nominal rivals within the Premier League by allowing such key players to leave.
No, it is, and there's a degree of confidence behind that, which is sort of impressive in its own way. And you just wonder, like, I just don't know. Like, obviously the City ownership thing is so, it's well documented. Like, reservations people would rightly have about elements of it, and you kind of wonder, like, I mean, it feels like this tap is going to be turned on forever. But clearly, there's some awareness of the need to do some business of that nature. And I think the problem as well too, like we would have had this mindset that you don't let players go from your club to another Premier League rival, but the financial muscle of the Premier League is such that it's actually very hard to find clubs overseas that can maybe afford or can pay anything remotely approaching the same fee or be able to meet the wage demands of some of these players. And as we see, Barcelona are trying to do it at the moment by taking a liberal approach to interpretations of rules. And that's, or just spending tomorrow's money today. in a way that sort of sets an example of unsustainability, which sort of pegs why like professional football is a weird industry sometimes, like where losses are just like it's what you do. This is, you can get away with it, so you do it. But I mean, this is the problem in some respects, that there's maybe only one or two or three clubs. Of course, you can mention PSG, and they can do it as well. But like when you have these top Premier League players at top Premier League clubs, and you want to shift them, it's hard. It's harder to go outside the Premier League than it might have been previously.
You mentioned PSG. What did you make of what were very unusual scenes at the weekend, where PSG stormed to victory? Shouldn't really matter. Kylian Mbappe misses a penalty, but then tries to nick the ball away from Neymar to take the second penalty. As it transpires, at least what's been reported by the French media, is that Neymar has become incredibly aware that Mbappe wanted him to go, and it seems that Mbappe wields a certain amount of power. Messi seemed to be incredibly taken aback by the frosty scenes between Neymar and Messi at the weekend too. And then we had the video that a lot of people have probably shared around on social media of PSG on the break. Eventually the ball goes across to Messi over on the other side, and Mbappe just stops running towards the box. And as it worked out, if he kept going, he could have had a goal, because Neymar ends up shooting a cross goal where he could have been there. It seems all is not particularly rosy at the Parc des Princes at the moment.
Yeah, and like, I'm not going to lie, right? I've tuned out of the PSG circus just a small bit, but I was sort of reading about this stuff at the weekend, and you're thinking, like, the whole Mbappe about turn to stay, and the stuff that was reported around it, that I'm not sure has ever been denied, around sort of his the say he would be given and stuff around and behind the scenes. But I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if they've tried to water down that in any respect.
No, I think the feeling seems to be, Dan, that there was at least a kernel of truth in the conversation around that this went way beyond PSG giving him €300 million to stay over the course of the contract, that actually genuinely Mbappe would now be consulted. I think there was a bit of a joke about him being the director of football. It's not quite that, but Mbappe will be consulted about hirings, particularly that they have on a managerial level. Yeah,
so like, I mean, all of which is going to leave you with a football club that is not normal. Like, that's just not a way that it operates. And like, frosty scenes on the pitch, when you are deemed to be sort of empowering players above and beyond their station, but then you're obviously dealing with players who are used to getting their own way previously or elsewhere, or for their national team or whatever it might be. I don't see how this is ever going to be a cocktail that's going to be especially successful. I mean, it's still, I mean, this is it. It's the sort of the trade-off with football now. I mean, obviously, like, the whole thing is in its own way just a disgusting element to it. And yet at the same time, watching PSG in the latter stages of the Champions League is sort of thrilling. Like, it's a guilty pleasure to sort of admit that even you're sort of absorbed by it, even when they fail, it's possibly even more entertaining because of the personalities that are involved. And it feels like we're just going to be talking about the same story again next year. Like, how does this change? Like, how does, like, is there going to be some story written next May about how they did it and how they managed to put their issues to a side to reach their holy grail? You just can't see that happening.
No, it's so awkward for Galtier having come in this situation as well. Like, I think Pochettino had a real problem trying to find balance across the team last year. And again, they've basically banked on everything being about that front three firing in Europe, because they should win Ligue 1 with the amount of talent that they have across the team. Even if there are, instances like last weekend, they still won the game 5-1. They're probably going to win the vast majority of games domestically. And then they have to get to a point where they're able to take out some of the European giants who might be well set up to stop them. And the vast majority of players they have around that front three are functional players that they brought in to do the running that those three won't do. So, as you said, it's a wonderful sideshow every time that they play. And we saw that last year with the fantastical collapse that they had away from home against Real Madrid. I think a team who were a little bit more united and who were working a little bit harder for each other would have definitely won that tie. Like, PSG were the better team for the whole first game and probably 60 minutes of the second leg, but still found a way to collapse.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, like, you think about the Champions League and it's such an amazing competition that you can understand why that school of thought exists, that if you get all these super players and it's effectively knockout football, that it'll happen for you. Like, that their individual brilliance will win ties for you. And while, again, I mean, Real Madrid is not really a romantic story, but the fact is that when it came to the crunch of the Champions League last year, it was a different kind of knockout football effectiveness that prevailed. It was that sort of, the reliability, a sort of a degree of a functioning team sort of exceeding the sum of the parts that managed to get the job done. Whereas I suppose people in their sort of PlayStation world, in their fantasy football league world, there's an element of that with the PSG stuff, how it's put together. And yet those attributes can't sustain them through a knockout competition because it's so high end and it's so demanding that all those cracks, they eventually just they come to the fore in the course of that sort of 180-minute tie. Yeah. They just can't. Maybe PSG, you'd think they'd be perfect for a final, but they can't get to the final because they lose. They lose it somewhere along the way, as we've seen. There's this spectacular implosion somewhere, generally away from home, that kills them.
Yeah, it's going to be intriguing to see where they're at as well after the World Cup. If Lionel Messi is making a decision going into the last 6 months of his contract about whether he's going to go back to Barcelona or what he's going to do for next year, and then where Neymar is at about where he might want to move to next summer as well. When he comes back off a World Cup, which would be incredibly important for him in Brazil, probably his best chance to win the World Cup this time round. They might have a lot of demotivated stars in the second half of this season as well. You are with us on the football show here on Off the Ball. It is brought to you by Sky. Watch over 400 games this season from the Premier League, the Women's Super League, the Scottish Premiership and the EFL, all live on Sky Sports. We'll take a very short break. We'll look at the supermarket sweep that Manchester United are trying to do in the last few weeks of the window when we come back after these.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky, get all the football you love in one place across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky, get all the football you love in one place across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
Welcome back into the football show. Dan McDonnell is still here alongside me. Dan, we were talking about potential business for Manchester City in the rest of the window. Their neighbours, Manchester United, appear to have left most of the work that they need to do in the transfer market down to the last couple of weeks. Ralph Ragnick was saying last year that potentially they needed up to 10 players coming in because of the amount of bodies that were going to leave. The business started, but some of the deals that they were trying to do have stalled, including Frankie de Jong, which looks like it won't happen at this point. Then there was a talk about Rabiot and Arnautovic. Rabiot might still happen, but Arnautovic looks like Bologna are not going to allow him to leave. And outside of that, they need reinforcement in quite a few key positions. And now they're just going around and it seems just kind of throwing their look at anybody who might join.
There's all sorts of names in the last sort of 12 hours alone. And again, you're sort of trying to figure out where all these links are coming from, and some will be legit and some will be agent driven, and as Gary Neville pointed out last week, their situation is so dire that every potential club is can add a zero to what they're looking for, because this club is so clearly desperate. It's not sort of calculated signings. I mean, it's Caicedo from Brighton as well as another one that's been mentioned now, another Ecuadorian player. So I don't know. I can't piece all of this together into sort of a coherent game plan for what they're trying to do. It doesn't appear to be. I mean, you describe it as the supermarket sweep beforehand, and that seems accurate. I think again, you're dealing with the highest level of professional sport and the most popular sport in the world. And I think sometimes you can convince yourself into thinking that this is some world where all of the people involved within it are bestowed or with this vision that when they eventually produce the players, they're able to say, oh, no, this was the plan all along. We assure you, this was always, it's like when a club appoints a manager who's clearly their 8th target, and they say, well, this was our number 1 target all along. This is the person we always wanted. You feel like there's going to be a lot of that going on over the next couple of weeks with the next week or so with any recruitment that's done, and an attempt to portray it as anything other than desperation when it's clear that it is desperation.
It wasn't meant to be this way, though. Erik ten Hag was appointed early. Basically, before the season even finished, it was clear that he was going to take over. Ralf Rangnick was getting ready to exit stage left. He was no longer going to be around in the shadows, which was potentially going to be a problem for the new manager. He was off to manage Austria. Ten Hag comes in. I think he started a week earlier than planned. He didn't even go on the team holiday with Ajax, so he could start on the Monday directly after the season. He was even at the Crystal Palace game at the end of the year. So everything was in place early. John Murtha had come in to take over the role, to be far more hands-on the football side of things than would have been the case with Woodward previously. Darren Fletcher was meant to be having a key role on the football side of the company too. And yet, here we are, where they look as rudderless, and you're saying it's difficult as a journalist to put any kind of sense on the chaos, but it seems the club are in that equally chaotic state as well.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes the team you put out at the end of the week does reflect what's going on behind the scenes, and that's not always the case, but generally, it is sort of the case in this instance here. And yeah, of course, there'll be briefing and club positions and club spin on things put out. And when Ten Hag was coming in, it was very much he's going to be allowed to be the coach, to put his own vision on the team. But that the club maybe didn't want this all-powerful manager, because they were maybe going to try and deal with somebody off the field stuff and make his job easier for him in a way. And that's how it was certainly pitched or portrayed. And there was obviously they changed their mind maybe on Pochettino, and they were going for this type of manager. But you're left in a situation now where, it's stating the obvious. I'm sure it's been said plenty of times. He's been undermined by certain things that have happened. In saying that as well, he still has to accept responsibility as well for putting out a team that gets done 4-0 at Brentford, and concedes that many goals early. That doesn't sort of speak to a great level of preparation. But then, clearly the players that are there, some of them are there are probably gone in some respects, they're sort of mentally shot by everything that's happened. And it's all sort of come together, sort of this sort of perfect storm that's led itself to sort of almost inevitable failure in the season ahead. And football fans love transfers, right? There's nothing they love more than transfers. And in some ways, there'll be people just loving all of this. Every 5 or 6 hours is a new name, and this is great stuff. But really, at this stage of the transfer window, it's the clubs that aren't really doing too much business at all, unless you're Leicester or someone. That's the extreme version of it. But ones that aren't doing too much are generally the ones that are generally quite competent and in control of where they're going.
Yeah, it's no coincidence, Dan, you've Nottingham Forest, who are trying to sign, every player that's available in Europe, it would seem, at the moment, and spending 120 million quid. And again, this is a case of they clearly identified their squad was one coming up from the Championship where they had to add quality in, so they're scrambling to try and get players in. It reminds me of Fulham a couple of years ago when they did something similar and signed the Khan family 9 or 10 players quite late in the window. That's usually a sign, though, that you've got a very disconnected strategy with your squad, and you're buying to try and solve an issue there. If you're in a case where you're at a fairly settled team, like Manchester United, while they need definitely players coming in, there are seasoned internationals, there are big winners there, there's big names there, and yet they're feeling that they have to do a remarkable amount of business late in the window here. That is a terrible sign. No, it is.
And look, the Forest one is a sort of an interesting one as well. I know it did win at the weekend. I thought it was sort of some good goalkeeping.
Dean Henderson was,
he was exceptional. And I sort of feel like, you can't use one win to change your opinion. I sort of would feel that their strategy surely can't work. It's sort of too thrown together. Sometimes the team that comes up from the Championship, it's a degree of momentum and togetherness carries them a certain way, and then it's the second season syndrome that sort of kicks in. And who knows? Steve Cooper is meant to be a very good manager, and maybe they've recognised, and they had loads of players on loan last season, so it wasn't maybe they had the option to keep a settled team together. But still, that's Forest coming up, who have been it's their first time in the Premier League in over 2 decades, and maybe there's an element of there's a degree of panic because it's the cost of not, the thought of dropping out again is almost unthinkable. But when you have a club like Manchester United with all the sort of scouting resources and everything they would have, they should have the best in class in everything, and they clearly don't have that. That's why it's even more damning that they're in a situation. It's not like Man City years ago when they were sort of new money and they're signing Robinho in January, and like even Newcastle with all the mad money that's clearly behind them, they've actually been reasonably calculated in how they've done things, and maybe not been as sort of panic buy as people thought they might be, and yet it's actually sort of Manchester United with this sort of quirky model that they have anyway, and where do the owners stand and what are they doing, but they're still like spending loads of cash, but sort of in a really wild way.
Yeah, did you see the graphic that Neville and Carragher threw up before Monday Night Football last night? I'll admit I missed it because generally I tend to flick on close enough to kick off as opposed to watching the full hour build-up. I know some people love it on Monday Night Football, but they basically looked at all of the Manchester United signings that have been made since Ferguson left. So it was like a 10-year, basically almost like a power rankings. It was even in red, amber and green. There was 2 players in green as basically unqualified successful signings, and they were Bruno Fernandes and Zlatan Ibrahimovic. They were the only 2 of the, I think, 80 players that were up on the board. The one that really caught me though, because I wonder, is this just, you know, at this stage, complete apology for Maguire on the English media? They had put Harry Maguire at 80 million quid into amber. He was one of the few players that was seen as kind of a mini success of a signing. I couldn't believe they had Maguire that high up, and some other players who've been, you know, decent like Juan Mata were in the red.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, Neville and Carragher are tremendous, but yeah, like maybe there's I always say there's like an English tax on players that inflates their value, and it probably, I mean Harry Maguire is getting a lot of global grief, and maybe there's an awareness of that in-house subconsciously, even that they don't want to add to that pile-on. I mean, I suppose you can break it down. I mean, like, he has played a lot of games, you know, and I suppose you talk about what is the definition of a flop. Like, if you sign someone for, you know, how many games did they even get from Alexis Sanchez, you know, for his wages or whatever. I mean, Maguire has played a large number of fixtures. He was involved in a team, you know, that did finish runners-up. So you could possibly argue the toss on that, you know, appearances relative to fee, and there could be bigger waste on, you know, bigger fees who barely started. But I would agree with you that it's a slightly questionable one. But maybe he's just become the symbol of the whole thing as well too, though. And like sometimes it's what he represents as opposed to all of his performances. But I see what you're saying there. I wouldn't disagree with what your take is on that.
These were kind of messy things that the new management kind of fell into at Old Trafford as well, where you're coming into a captain who's not even particularly popular with the fan base, you know, whatever about the outside criticism at the moment when it comes to Maguire. You've Cristiano Ronaldo, who has very clearly been agitating to try and get a move away all summer, but there's probably no destination for Cristiano Ronaldo to go to. So he's got an unhappy player there who again is on massive wages and who he probably needs to keep around because of their lack of strikers. It's not like he can really drop Harry Maguire out of the team, even though potentially he could maybe play Varane and Lissandro beside each other. But you've got the pressure of him being the captain. Do you strip the captaincy away from, you know, one of the most expensive players in the club's history? Like, these were all kind of things that Ten Hag kind of had to come in and deal with, which have been quite awkward at the start as well.
Yeah, no, and I don't know, the Ronaldo thing again seems to be changing. Like, will he be there or not? Again, like, I sort of joked about it before, but there's an element of just sort of, you know, just wake us up on September the 1st and let us know if Ronaldo was still there or not, and we can do without the noise in the meantime. But the Maguire thing, yeah, like, there's noise either way, and you don't know, like it's hard maybe to speak from the outside of it, that and I know there was sort of stuff about even Ronaldo and Maguire and the dynamic there maybe wouldn't be terrific, but like, maybe the new manager goes into the dressing room and sort of looks around and says, well, who can I rely on here to rally people, and what is the cost of like stripping someone of the captaincy versus the scrutiny, and how will it play with other people? But like, I sometimes think you can't even analyse some of this United stuff. You know, you're trying to. It's sort of a crisis-ridden government, and to sort of that it's completely lost the run of itself completely, and it's sort of one cock up after the next, and to like isolate one thing, to analyse one thing in isolation is quite difficult because it's all part of the domino effect of the madness in some way, if you know what I mean. And you just sort of feel like that in sort of a couple of years' time, there's going to be like brilliant autobiographies and stuff coming out that will give us the full insight of what was going on. And I know there's been glimpses of it, even Dean Henderson sort of coming out and speaking honestly about how he was meant to be the first choice goalkeeper, and they changed up their plans and how things happened again, which goes back to the initial point that you think there's just some really educated thought process here because it's a sort of a club and a sort of $1 billion industry or whatever, and it's not. It's just humans making bad mistakes, which can happen down in your local five-a-side team or something, and it can happen in Manchester United too, which is the scary thing.
Yeah, Sam Lurkhurst actually had a great tweet up earlier on today where some guys had taken pictures of earlier this morning where the paint was being replenished, the red paint on the Alex Ferguson stand, and he almost said it was symbolic of Manchester United right now, because Gary Neville is on the TV last night complaining about the fact that over the last 10-15 years Old Trafford has been allowed to stagnate and actually parts of the ground need a serious revamp. And within hours of Gary Neville saying that on the TV, there's an incredibly cosmetic effect happening on the outside the stadium where they're repainting the faded bricks red on the back of the Alex Ferguson stand. So I'm sure Manchester United will point out that they do maintenance work all the time. This was always planned, but it was curious timing just after Gary Neville was talking about it last night. Like, it is difficult. You have to kind of, in a way, divorce the Glazers to a certain extent if we're going to analyse what's been going wrong with the football on the pitch and what's been happening with the players. But then ultimately, if anyone wants to take a look at basically the last 20 years under the Glazers, the investment has been just about what the club has been making themselves. They're the only club in the Premier League who've been receiving dividends in recent years. Even during COVID-19, they deferred a dividend payment and still took it this year. That, you know, generally they're going up against teams where the owners are investing capital themselves, like with Man City. And Manchester United, for the best part, have been an ATM for the Glazers over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, like, I mean, as I said, like that's been laid out quite clearly by some sort of solid sort of reporting, which is sort of straight down the line, not sort of pushing a particular angle. I mean, those figures sort of speak for themselves, and this is where the anger comes from. You know, this is where now I know there's talk of protests again next week and more gestures next week, and like it's part of the rancor and stuff that was there. And I mean, like, again, what can you add to it really? Like, it's clear as day really what type of ownership group that they are. They will defend themselves by pointing that they probably, you know, they will say they haven't been found wanting in terms of like some of the big investments, but you know, some of them even for the wrong reasons, and sort of, again, it's not like, to me, like you and at a smaller level, like locally or whatever, like you see different sort of ownership models and groups coming in, and like the culture that they set and the decisions they make from the top are as much as they can be divorced from elements of it. Like if you concentrate on having the right culture in a club and the right tactical appointments for the right reasons, and as I said earlier, you know, like it shouldn't be entirely complex for like an amazingly powerful brand and an amazingly successful club to have a sort of a really established, sophisticated sort of sporting director, you know, recruitment structure, you know. But that the absence of that, and even you hear locally, and there still will be sort of question marks around even some of their work, even in underage football where they traditionally would have been so strong, that sort of the standards have slipped, and it does coincide with you know, the Glazer years, and of course the over-reliance on Ferguson and stuff for a long period of time as well, which possibly was never going to be healthy in terms of the longer term. But there's nothing original about saying that.
Yeah, the football show is brought to you here and Off the Ball by Sky. Watch over 400 games this season from the Premier League, Women's Super League, the Scottish Premiership and the EFL, all live on Sky Sports. Just on ownership, Dan, before I let you go, a couple of stories are kind of doing the rumour rounds at the moment, and certainly lots of reports in Waterford about them potentially being taken over, and there's also rumours about Athlone currently as well. Could we be seeing 2 regime changes potentially within the League of Ireland here?
Oh, you tell me what's going on in Athlone, Will. What's the rumour mill telling us now?
So the rumour mill in Athlone currently, and I would stress these are purely rumours, but certainly ones that are there locally, is that potentially American ownership were looking at potentially coming in and investing in the club. And I think there was kind of a bit of a kind of a casual relationship between Athlone Town and Dundalk's former owners previously. So I'm not sure if that's a potential investment from that end. And also there was a group who were looking to come into the League of Ireland, I think about 2 years ago, who were trying to get a first division licence. I'm not sure if they're still calling themselves the Irish C Group or the Irish C FC Group.
Yes.
There was talk that they could potentially be looking to buy Athlone as a way of having a team in the first division. So if you buy the team, potentially the men's team, that will give you a licence into the league. So they've been the rumours we've heard about in Athlone, but I think it's a lot more firm in Waterford though.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest and speculation there too, and there definitely was a good relationship between the previous Dundalk ownership and people at Athlone anyway, because there was obviously loan players that moved, and I think in some deep dark moments in Dundalk there was people wondering if the club was going to be moved to Athlone one day, but that might have just been that was the mode they were in at that stage, fearing all sorts in Dundalk. That was the Waterford one is way more substantive. Like there's definitely something happening there. I'm not sure if it's fully over the line yet as such, speaking today, but there's this character called Andy Pilley who Fleetwood Town owner, and part of what is now a developing model and trend within football club ownership is that you'll have someone who owns a club in England, say, but like the City Group, I suppose, the Manchester City one, but on a smaller level, you see these clubs, these characters who own a club in one country, but they have a network in other countries. And this guy, Andy Pilley, he has Fleetwood, but I think he has a club maybe I think in South Africa and somewhere else as well too, maybe the UAE. I'm not 100% sure I'm right on that, but why Ireland? I suppose there is a Brexit play there as well too. We see the sort of the emerging talent that's come out of the league. I mean, Fleetwood have recently signed Promise Omashare from Bows, so they're aware of it. I think there's clubs who maybe wouldn't have looked at Ireland before. Individuals who wouldn't have looked at Ireland before, probably looking at that angle, looking at all the traditional stuff like European qualification and all of that, and everyone comes with that ambition. But I like Waterford have had a few changes in recent years. They haven't all worked out in the way that people maybe saw them initially. There's a lot of people have been welcomed in the door with open arms as this is going to be brilliant, and then maybe it's turned a bit sour. So hopefully in this instance, they're turning to people who are in for the long haul. And to be fair to Andy Pilley, I know maybe there's been some sort of reportage about elements of I suppose non-football activity that was looked into. I can't really go into that in great detail because, like, there's it's not something you need to discuss some of that with him to fully be aware of it. But I mean, with Fleetwood Town, like the commitment is long-standing, has carried the club through a number of divisions, and he's been in there for the long haul, and there's sort of no doubting his sort of commitment to that process. So I suppose Waterford will be hoping that that same commitment will extend to them.
Watch this space. Dan, great stuff as always. We'll chat to you again soon.
Thank you.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky, get all the football you love in one place across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.